Those great ships were very important.
You were fully aware of the history of the undertaking that you were joining.
If you went to school, your parents were in India, you went by P&O.
We were the only shipping company that were actually producing theatrical shows.
They're connecting with something special, something aspirational.
People were waiting to see this brand new, state-of-the-art passenger ship.
It really is tied to the whole culture of the UK.
I think it's great to be part of this long story.
We are Britain's favourite cruise line, so we shall be around for many years to come.
The origins of what was to become the Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company and the roots of P&O Cruises can be traced back to 1837. The new steamships of the day offered new business, long voyages and adventure. Two former naval officers, Brodie McGee Wilcox and Arthur Anderson, embraced the opportunities and they were determined to establish the first steamship service to Portugal and Spain. The Peninsula Steam Navigation Company was born. In 1837, the company started its regular service using 7 steamships. The key to success was the Admiralty contract carrying mail to the Iberian Peninsula. The first steamship, as seen before, was the William Fawcett, a name that came up in Canberra years later as one of the function rooms was named after it.
There were a huge number of small shipping lines all competing for business, and I think it was Brodie Wilcox and Arthur Anderson's total belief in steam power, which was then still quite experimental, and their persistence in getting the government and the Admiralty to open up mail contracts that really led to their huge growth.
The mail contract virtually would pay for the running costs of the ship. The profits would come from the passengers, but the mails were extremely important. The ships were known as RMS, Royal Mail Ships.
Conditions were often perilous, but the new service was highly successful. Wilcox and Anderson were asked to extend their routes to Alexandria in Egypt and eventually onto Suez and India. Oriental was subsequently added to the company name and 2 new ships ordered, each 240 feet long with 150 berths. The first, Hindustan, sailed from Southampton in September 1842.
P&O had sort of 2 fleets of ships. One fleet would go as far as Alexandria and in Egypt. And then another fleet would go to the other end of the Suez Peninsula and take the mails from it. But you had to cross the peninsula, they had to cross the desert.
Before the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the 150 miles overland to the Red Sea to connect with India was grueling. In spite of this, P&O's new service became a vital link with India for passengers, mail and cargo.
The communication, the infrastructure of ports were built primarily by P&O.
They were steam-powered ships, so they needed coal. There was no coal in the Far East, so they had to set up coaling stations. There was no fresh water at Suez, so all that had to be carried overland by camel. And there was no suitable food, at least not suitable that P&O saw for their passengers, so they even had their own farm at Cairo and just outside Cairo. And gradually they'd build up hotels and all the offices across the world, so a huge influence right across the East.
Arthur Anderson was a man of vision and is often credited with the idea of cruising.
In 1844, the company offered what can be considered as its first cruise. By linking P&O ships sailing on the scheduled services, it was possible for passengers to tour the Mediterranean. In 1853, the mail routes were extended. When the company's newest ship, the Tucson, arrived in Sydney, this was the start of the first mail run to Australia.
A menu from 1862 gives an idea of what passengers could expect to eat on their voyage.
I can see that there are a lot of similarities in the food that we serve. Here there was a mutton broth on. We're still very, very famous for our homemade soups on board. We're very famous for our roast of the day. Even in 1862 they were having roast turkey. One thing I can see from this menu that is still very popular today, of course, is the curry. There are a lot of items here that we wouldn't put on the menus today. You've got sheep's head braised in Madeira, you've got stewed pig's feet. Would not be seen as a favourite dish on a P&O Cruises holiday menu.
By the 1870s, nearly 90% of the trade between Britain, India, China and the Far East and Australia was in the hands of P&O.
In the height of the empire, they were bringing administrators, government officials, tea planters. They were bringing school children from the public schools in England back to their parents and then back to Britain. And the ships themselves reflected all this. You had open decks, of course, and you had awnings to try and keep cool. The heat was colossal.
P&O embraced the latest proven technology. By the latter part of the 19th century, new ships were steel-hulled vessels with triple expansion engines and screw propellers. In 1904, P&O introduced their first programme of pleasure cruises using the 160-berth Vectis. It was a novel way for those who could afford it to see ports of the Mediterranean. The 1900s were a period of significant expansion. In 1910, the company took over Blue Anchor Line and renamed it the P&O Branch Service. Unlike P&O's stately first-class passages, the branch service offered cheaper third-class accommodation, which was largely used by emigrants. 4 years later, on the threshold of the First World War, P&O merged with British India Line. BI had provided passenger, mail and cargo services across the Indian Ocean and to Southeast Asia. Its fleet of 131 steamers was nearly double that of P&O's 70-strong fleet. A condition of the mail contract meant P&O had to make ships available during times of war. The company's vessels had carried troops during the Crimean War nearly 60 years before. In 1914, 100 of the merged company's fleet were requisitioned. Many would be lost. 44 in 1917 alone. P&O continued to grow. It acquired a variety of other companies and a major share in Orient Line. By the mid-1920s, the company had a very large fleet and was worth £1 million. A crisis was looming. Within a few years, P&O's credit balance fell by 75%, thanks to the infamous Wall Street crash of 1929. Despite world recession, one of P&O's most significant ships entered service the same year. At 17,000 tons, Viceroy of India was built for the company's Bombay service and was also used for cruising.
Viceroy of India had a very innovative machinery. She was the first turbo-electric ship, so that was quite an innovation for P&O. Her interiors were traditional, carved woods and big domes and beautiful carved smoke rooms, and she was a gorgeous ship.
Viceroy featured an indoor swimming pool, the first on a P&O liner.
Viceroy of India was also very unique in that all the first-class accommodation was in single cabins with interconnecting doors, so a very different design of ship.
In the 1920s and 30s, most ships still offered two classes of travel, but there was little onboard entertainment for either. Basic deck games like quoits, tug-of-war and skipping contests were popular with some passengers. Activities like the horse racing game made full use of open decks and drew plenty of spectators. Passengers also provided their own homemade entertainment, from competitions to fancy dress contests and concerts. During the depressed years of the 1930s, P&O boldly launched 5 new 23,000-ton liners, known as the Straths, or White Sisters. The first of the 5, Strathnavar, went into service in October 1931 and featured the company's new livery.
It was the first time that P&O built white ships. The first 2 of them had 3 funnels. didn't need 3 funnels, 3 yellow funnels. They only needed 1 working funnel, the other 2 were dummies. The Strathmore was the first ship P&O had that was actually launched and named by a member of the royal family. And Strathmore was launched by the Duchess of York at that time. That very much was the look of P&O in the 30s. Those great ships were very important.
Although cruising had gained popularity, P&O's main trade was still scheduled line voyages. The company continued to grow. By the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, P&O and its subsidiaries had 371 ships operating worldwide. Within a month of war, 12 vessels were requisitioned. The so-called conversion to armed merchant cruiser was inadequate. Each vessel was fitted with 8 6-inch guns that were already more than 40 years old.
The most well-known episode involving a P&O ship in the Second World War was the Battle of the Rawalpindi, which was converted to an armed merchant cruiser patrolling off Iceland and found herself trapped between the 2 most powerful German enemy ships afloat, the Gneisenau and the Scharnhorst.
Rawalpindi was guarding a convoy of all things. This little P&O ocean liner was guarding a convoy, and she was suddenly attacked.
She knew she couldn't survive. The captain put on as spirited a battle as he could, and she was sunk within 5 hours.
More losses were to follow, including the luxurious Viceroy of India. By the end of the war, half the company's fleet had been destroyed. The post-war years in Britain were a time of do or die for many companies. For P&O, it was time to rebuild its fleet. The first of the new ships was Himalaya, which entered service in 1949 on the company's Australia route. Others like Tucson, Iberia and Arcadia helped usher in the new era. An era in which line voyages were still commonplace, but cruising became increasingly important.
It's a thrilling moment when the liner Arcadia is being made ready to put to sea. Aboard her on this voyage are 1,200 excited passengers. Southward
for a bath or a hot freshwater bath. If you've never had a hot saltwater bath, you've never lived.
At the means of transportation. It's more like a luxury hotel, with every possible need catered for, and a sea view in every direction.
In 1954, when I was a very young man and went on my very first cruise with my parents, and we travelled in those days, even the Arcadia, 28,000 was a 2-class ship even for cruising. And the food I remember as being wonderful. The great excitement for me was to be given a curry. I'd never had a curry in my life.
P&O's post-war ships carried a mixture of first and second-class passengers. They included thousands of 10-pound Poms, Brits travelling on assisted passages to begin new lives in Australia.
There are, people whose grandparents and great-grandparents travelled on these great ships, emigrated on the ships, so it has a special place in the heart of people, and that's unique to brands with great depth and heritage.
The Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company continued to expand and diversify. In 1960, it bought the remaining balance of the Orient Line. For a brief period, passenger operations were renamed P&O Orient Lines. The combined operations offered trips that circled the world. The following year, educational cruises were introduced under the flag of British India.
However you go about it, educational cruises have plenty to offer. But you can add to that by your enthusiasm and foresight. There are many ways to make the most of the opportunities.
My first experience of cruising was actually on SS Uganda as a schoolgirl. I was fortunate enough to go on one of the Mediterranean cruises. And of course that ship was so different from any other because half of it was for adult passengers and half of it was for school children, and never the twain shall meet, which was a very interesting arrangement. It was the first ship I'd ever been on, and I can remember vividly the dormitory and my high bunk that rocked me to sleep at night, and the classroom where we enjoyed lessons about the places we were going to visit. and of course the visits themselves. And I think all of us on board the ship in those very formative years had a fabulous time. Whether I thought then that I'd be back working more closely with P&O Cruises in later years, well, I don't know, but you never know with these things.
I was lucky enough to go on a school ship called Navassa when I was 12 years old. I actually had my 12th birthday on board, and I loved it so much that I decided I wanted to work on a ship when I got my career. And at that time they didn't take females in the Royal Navy, so my father said, well, if you go into the Merchant Navy you could work on a merchant vessel, maybe a cruise ship or something. So I went into catering at Blackpool College just specifically so that I could work on a cruise ship. In 1981 I was lucky enough to get a job with P&O on Canberra.
By the 1960s, the impact of jet travel was clear. An increasing number of people were choosing to fly rather than travel by liner. There was a general slump in British shipping.
It was the end of the line as a direct passenger. If you went to school and your parents were in India, you went by P&O. Australia, whatever it is. The cricket team used to go out to Australia on our ships, etc. But that all changed when airliners came.
In spite of this, two new liners were on the horizon. Oriana was modern, yet conventional. The other new ship was innovative and progressive. This was Canberra. Sea trials were carried out in April 1961.
Canberra, of course, was probably the greatest difference for ship design, and with the aluminium superstructure making her a lot lighter, very high speed. People just loved her. Acres of open teak deck. Very, very different sort of ship, modern, contemporary decor, not like the older ships of the 30s with the very country house style.
The facilities were much better. There were cabins in the old ships where you had 4 and 6 living together. That was very rare when Canberra came into service. There were 1 or 2 cabins down in the after end where they had what were called friendly fours. I'm not quite sure whether they were quite so friendly at the end of the cruise, but the cabins were very much larger, very much superior to what they had been in the 1930s and the 1940s.
A beauty, an absolute beauty. Engines aft, funnels aft. She was built primarily for 2 classes to Australia, and then she became a cruise ship.
She was a ship ahead of her time. She was loved by many, and she did have the odd hiccup along the way, but she was a ship that was only, I think, probably equalled in any respect by the Oriana, which followed in the 1990s.
By the end of the decade, the number of people emigrating to Australasia had dwindled. Canberra would no longer be viable as a line voyager. The ship was turned over to full-time cruising, starting with a series of cruises from her home port of Southampton and New York. As demand for open-class cruising grew, further routes were added, including an annual world cruise. It was a changing world, but P&O maintained its traditions.
When I joined P&O, one could almost say that you were joining a club. Everyone was very heavily integrated with each other. It was very much a family organisation, and that included everyone from the chairman right down to the lowly cadet and the crew on the various ships. There was a brotherhood amongst the employees of P&O Lines.
The mail service was paramount. The passengers were there, of course, but some of the captains not terribly interested in the passengers at all. They saw their role as getting the ship safely from A to B with the mails. That changed dramatically when cruising started to take on a more important role, and the captains then had to decide that the passengers were actually probably more important than the mail and the cargo.
Drinks, and we're invited to meet the captain, the officers, and each other. This useful getting-to-know-you function is pleasantly spiced with canapes, cocktails, and genial conversation.
The crew members of the ships that I was working on, the old Oriana, they were members of ship's company from those days, and they had the P&O heritage running right through them. They were not shy of telling you that, you had to get some sea time in before you were a real sailor.
Bill Allison rose through the ranks to become P&O's first and only Commodore Cruise Director.
When I first came to sea, we were called liaison officers, and there was one on because it was first and tourist in those days, first class and tourist class, and we had one liaison officer in both and one hostess in both, and that was how we started out all those years ago.
You were fully aware of the history of the undertaking that you were joining. The management in those days, when you first joined the company, we had lessons in the history on the heritage of the company.
P&O's flagship, Canberra, was very popular, but the mid-1960s saw further decline in the shipping trade. In 1966, a strike by the National Union of Seamen left 5 of the company's ships stranded in Southampton, along with those of other shipping lines. The following year brought strikes at the London and Liverpool docks, and war between Egypt and Israel closed the Suez Canal. P&O finally withdrew its passenger service to the Far East. As the cost of air travel fell, all line voyages came to an end.
The old ships were being phased out, with very few exceptions. They were not fit for purpose, and a very strategic decision was taken to go into cruising.
The company rearranged its former passenger routes into 3 main cruising regions. At the same time, P&O were looking for ways to expand and replace its older ships.
It was decided that they would test the waters with a small passenger ship which was being built in a place called Riva Trosa in Italy, and I was appointed chief officer of her and stood by the building of this small passenger liner, 20,000 tons, which was subsequently named the Spirit of London. And we sailed under the P&O flag out to the Caribbean, and then started a cruising season in America with basically American passengers. Our rivals at the time were a shipping company called Princess Cruises, who had just 2 ships, the Pacific Princess and the Island Princess, which were subsumed into our fleet, and it was decided that the Princess mark, if you like, was more successful in the American market than P&O was, so Spirit of London had her name change, became the Sun Princess, and the 3 ships occupied the start of what became a sister company, Princess Cruises, a part of the P&O group.
Canberra and her crew adapted well to cruising, but one area of life at sea hadn't changed in decades.
Because I had a theatrical background, I decided that what was missing from the ships was any form of entertainment.
Even in the early 1980s, apart from dancing, entertainment was still the homegrown variety, often organised by the passengers themselves.
And so one started by producing things with the officers on board, review shows. I'd done several review shows in London, including going up to the Edinburgh Fringe. So I pinched all those various sketches, got the officers together, did it, and we called it the Officers Review Show. And that's really what we did in the ballroom. And slowly but surely it grew up until eventually we managed to get Roy, who was a professional theatre director ashore, to start writing shows.
Strangely enough, nobody was doing tribute shows in those days. Now everybody does them. The West End's full of tribute shows. But so I did a whole, about 15, 16 scripts from the Irving Berlin show, the Gershwin show, the Rodgers and Hammerstein show, the Rodgers and Hart show. And that's really how it started, as far as I was concerned.
Slowly but surely, we were the only shipping company that were actually producing theatrical shows on board the ships.
I took the small company away on the World Cruise. We worked in this what was the cinema, so there was no room backstage, so one had to be very clever about moving people about. We did 13 plays in 13 weeks on the World Cruise. The audiences absolutely loved it.
By 1982, Canberra was firmly established as one of Britain's favourite cruise ships, but she would soon be sailing into international conflict. News of Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands came during the last leg of Canberra's world cruise.
Passengers probably didn't notice that a little working party boarded by boat, and they were working out whether they could convert her into a troop carrier and support ship.
Everybody worked together. There was a wonderful commitment about the port. It just went on round the clock. People were determined that Southampton would do the job for Canberra.
Every single seafarer that went was a volunteer. A volunteer. People, often the public, don't realise that. They were all volunteers.
She also carried 15 of the P&O female crew. I think it was the first time that female crew had served on a merchant ship at war as crew.
We volunteered as ship's company, and we found out later that the Ministry of Defence had said that the girls had to get off, and the company had turned around and said, well, the girls have volunteered, they're ship's company, they volunteered like everybody else, and the ship's going to be in no danger, so why not? So we sailed.
It was the most moving occasion. There were families everywhere with flags and messages, and all the guys, the paras and the commandos came out on deck, and as we just moved away very gradually, all the streamers went down the side of the ship. And I think, to be honest, that at that stage no one ever thought we would actually go into any harm's way. I think the majority of people just weren't expecting that they were going to be away for 94 days, as it turned out.
When everybody went, including, I think, Margaret Thatcher at the time, nobody actually expected we'd have to go the full rack.
They cross-decked some of the Marines over to Invincible, and we asked what was going to happen to everybody else, and they said that they were going to be landed directly from Canberra, and that was the first that we knew that we were actually going to go into the Falklands. And we felt totally ill-prepared for it because we hadn't really got cold weather gear to survive in such temperatures.
For me, the thing really struck home was when they started ripping up carpets and gluing them onto the windows to stop the light being shown, and suddenly it all became a bit serious, and there was a definite shift in, I can't say apprehension, but this was going to be a serious situation we were going to.
We had Commander Bourne, who was on the bridge all the time, and he gave us really, really well informed from the bridge, telling us what was happening really. And he would say things like, okay, we've got the aircraft have taken off from Argentina, they're 200 miles away, they're gaining, they're 50 miles away, 20 miles, take cover, take cover, take cover. And then they bombed us.
Wave after wave of these jets came over, and it was just remarkable. We weren't touched.
We all remember, I think, her welcome home, which was phenomenal as she sailed back into Southampton water.
It was dense, dense fog. It was as if a big pair of velvet curtains were drawn back, and we emerged through this fog into the sunlight, and this armada of hundreds and hundreds of boats, of yachts, of pleasure cruisers. It was simply unbelievable. And there was the old girl, Canberra. She was wearing her rust-streaked hull with great pride.
The emotion between the people on the quayside was emotional. Yeah, it was unbelievable because we had a lot of military personnel that got their family on the quayside. All the P&O family were on the quayside. It was unbelievable day.
With the flagship refitted for cruising, just a year later P&O was embroiled in another hostile situation. This time it faced a takeover bid from Trafalgar House, owners of Cunard. Under the new chairman, Geoffrey Sterling, the bid was successfully fought off and the company's fortunes transformed.
We made many acquisitions, and we started then to build ships again, which hadn't been done for some time, and gradually expand the whole fleet, and then expand hugely into the port businesses and other areas, very large in real estate because we owned bovies that we built all over the world in all different areas. And as I said, we came up to being about 84,000 people within the company, and we're operating in about 120 countries.
Part of the 80s expansion included the acquisition of the Italian cruise company, Sitmar International. As the decade progressed, onboard entertainment also continued to expand.
Stadium Theatre Company started in that little area, the first class area for our first class passengers on Canberra, and it was actually called the Stadium. And they enclosed it in, and that's how the Stadium Theatre Company began.
And what the audiences on that cruise loved was the fact that the cruise staff that they met every day when they were playing bingo or whatever, they were in the shows.
Another development in entertainment was the introduction of classical theme cruises. Now in their 28th year, they were often presented by Richard Baker. 1995 saw the introduction of 2 new names to the P&O Cruises fleet. Sea Princess, part of the P&O Group since 1979, was renamed Victoria. And in April, the all-new Oriana made her spectacular debut.
Just over 2 years since her keel was laid, and with Commodore Gibb in command, the P&O flagship enters her home waters for the first time.
Lord Stirling had required really, that I go to take command of this new ship when she came into service, and I was sent over to Germany to watch her being built and to have a little bit of input with the officers who were already there, like the chief officer and the chief engineer. And to see a ship being constructed in this manner, where 500-ton chunks were being placed very accurately onto the ship, like a huge Meccano set, was something I had never experienced before. People were waiting to see this brand new, state-of-the-art passenger ship which had been built to really start off a new cruising era. This was purpose-built for cruising, the first real purpose-built passenger ship for the British market.
I still remember, though, the first time that I saw her, which was at the naming ceremony when Her Majesty the Queen came down to launch the vessel. It was one of those occasions which I think at the time the company did extremely well. The Queen's presence obviously made it that little bit special.
We were able to do it without people thinking, that's a bit pompous, isn't it? How can a company do that? This company could. It's part of the imperial past, part of today and part of tomorrow. So in a sense, it was natural.
The one aspect that I noticed more than anything else was the airiness of the Oriana. She was bright, she was elegant, she was a very modern vessel, and a new era had begun.
This was the first theatre, as opposed to a show lounge, that had ever been on a cruise ship before. And, so it was marvellous.
The technology was incredible. We have what was called AIS, automatic identification of ships. The ship's radar was terribly modern. Computers had come in so that we were tied into satellite navigation. The voyages could be programmed ahead of time, and a button could be pressed as we left the pilotage at the Nab Tower, and the ship would then steam herself to the next destination without any help from me.
After 36 years of service, Canberra was withdrawn. In 2000, P&O announced the demerger of its P&O Cruises business. P&O Princess Cruises plc became a listed company independent of previous parent. 3 years later, P&O Cruises became part of Carnival plc, joining other big names like Cunard.
We had discussions with Lord Sterling, who was the CEO of P&O for many years. Clearly, P&O, Princess, AIDA were all brands that we were very interested in. Obviously, with the long heritage and great reputation, and the fact that we were acquiring brands to grow globally, it was just a very natural partner for us.
The thread which runs through all of this is the consistency of the people who have worked for P&O Cruises. Very many of them, like indeed myself, are long-standing colleagues. We've seen this company through all the changes in the background, and we have made sure that its values, its tradition, its heritage have all been well preserved. So when you combine those attitudes, that passion for P&O Cruises, with the great benefits of the changes in the ownership structure, I think that we probably have a stronger company, a finer company than we've probably ever had before.
One of the unique features of P&O is its Britishness, and the fact that that it really is tied to the whole culture of the UK, and having a British wife, I know that that's very important to her too, and when she's aboard a P&O ship, she really feels at home.
Today, in the new era of modern cruising, P&O Cruises operates a fleet of 7 cruise liners. From the smallest, Adonia, named in 2011 by Dame Shirley Bassey, to the largest, Ventura, named by Dame Helen Mirren in 2008, and Azura, named by Darcy Bussell in 2010. Turnaround days in Southampton are a very precise operation.
On a ship with 3,500 passengers and then 1,400 crew, we're taking on somewhere in the region of 250 and 300 tons of food on a Southampton turnaround. We're using between 15 and 20 tons every day, which are colossal amounts when you think about it. Southampton to Southampton is our major cruising season from April until October. Then of course when the winter comes and the weather's not so good around Europe and around the UK, we tend to send our ships to the Caribbean, we send ships to South America, and we send ships to round world cruises. Of course this poses some very high challenges. We would, where possible, source a lot of our food in the UK, because a lot of items are very specific to UK cruising, like your kippers and your cheddar cheese, your Stilton, your back bacon, sausages. These items really, to a British passenger, we only make them properly in the UK. The menus of the past influence, certainly lunchtime we've always had a curry on our menus, and that's been a tradition going back from the old line voyages. Nowadays as well, we have a lot more restaurants on board. We don't just have a dining room where you have breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea. We have very intricate buffets on board where we open the buffets from lunch, from breakfast time right the way through to dinner, with a themed dinner evening every night, which may be Italian if we're selling Italian waters. It may be Indian, Oriental, it may be a British night, it may be a Carvery, maybe Mediterranean. We also have 10 or 12 different restaurants on board. And of course, in the last 5 years, we've had this fantastic relationship with the celebrity chefs, where we've had people like Gary Rhodes, Atul Kochhar, the Indian chef who has Michelin stars, and Marco Pierre White.
As a boy, I was fascinated by ships. I love the story of the Titanic. I love the story of the Normandy, the Britannic, the Olympic. All those great ships always fascinated me. And then one day, I was approached if I would consider being involved. And so I came on a ship, and I went on a short cruise. And if I'm honest, I fell in love overnight. When people come to the White Room, their expectations are quite high. And so therefore it's our job to make it special for them. And what's very important for me is that when they finish their dinner and they leave on a high. They leave feeling that they've been looked after.
The food offerings that we have on board the ship I think are very important to passengers. My belief is weather, entertainment and food with a British passenger play a huge part in their cruise.
The days of homemade amusements are long gone. Onboard entertainment is now very sophisticated and diverse.
The energy on stage and the excitement on stage hasn't changed in any way at all. But from the technical side, it's just gone in leaps and bounds.
We definitely rival any West End theatres or any touring houses around the country for the actual facilities that we can do. They really are full-blown automated theatres that can pick people up and spin people around, and we can do a number of different special effects.
People that don't cruise, they don't quite understand the quality of the structures of the theatres on board P&O cruise ships now.
Of course, being a ship, we can only hold so many sets backstage and so many costumes. So we have to plan integrally when these shows will go up and when we can bring the sets on and off.
So Headliners recruits about 160 performers in a year. They come to our rehearsal studios here in South London, where they'll be taught around 8 shows for their initial cruise. On a world cruise that can go up to 14 productions, so lots of material crammed in a very short space of time. A bit like a boot camp. So we teach everything in here, and then we send them out with the choreographers and the assistants, and they join the ship very, very quickly. In that we don't have a cast turnaround. They don't sit on board and watch the other cast perform. We literally take one cast off in the morning, the next cast get on, and 2 days later they do their first show.
Singers and dancers, and indeed the rest of the crew, usually do about 9 months on board, and I think that's just the right amount of time. Any more and you'd miss your family and friends too much. You might get a bit blasé about the job. But any less, then all the work that we put in 2 months of rehearsals in London. And then we can revel in that performance for 7 months and try and tweak and improve our performance and get it honed and to absolute perfection of what we can do.
We have our visiting guest entertainers, and they're always very diverse, from comedy magicians to vocalists to speciality acts. Every cruise we have a classical artiste, whether that might be a pianist or a classical guitar player. In addition to that, we have our music festival at sea theme cruises, which are very popular with our passengers.
I have always been very aware that you've got a very big cross-section of listeners attending your concerts. They wouldn't be very happy if you went out and gave them a programme of all contemporary music, of all Baroque music, of all Chopin or of all Mozart. They are there to have some very familiar pieces and perhaps some unfamiliar pieces, but tuneful.
When we're preparing the programmes, we like to bring something new and unique to the passengers on the P&O cruise ships, and I particularly enjoy playing Sam's original compositions, and the passengers love them as well.
As well as performing, Sam and Louise own one of the agencies that supply the company.
It's always nice to get fresh people in who have never done it before, and then our experience really helps us prepare them. And it's lovely because you can see an act develop and you can see them really start to understand what's required.
Our following just gets bigger and bigger. When I have passengers come up and they say, well, we've been coming to your concerts, but we didn't think we liked classical music, but we've enjoyed it so much that we're going to come again. And that is really great because we've introduced them to something that they wouldn't necessarily have gone to a concert to hear.
Over the years, the company has been synonymous with having guest artists.
There's always somebody that you know in the cruise staff or one of the officers or even the captain perhaps, and you're welcomed. It's very much like coming back to a family. Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. Feel home.
Well, I think it's great to be part of this long story. 175 years, that's quite something.
A favourite show of the passengers on the telly is Only Fools and Horses, so they thought I might be an interesting person to have on board to talk about that show and my life generally. So with great fear and trepidation, I'd never done anything like it before, I went on to the beautiful Oceana in 2008. And as soon as I walked on to that ship, I just fell in love with it. It's still, I think, my favourite, but everybody says their first ship is their favourite. I remember about 3 days after looking out to sea and thinking, this could be the life for me.
One of the unique things about speaking on a cruise ship is that you can make a speech and then the next minute you're talking to the people in the audience or the next day, or 2 days afterwards. And I think that's a good thing, because I welcome that sort of interaction, and it sort of adds a special dimension to everything.
I'm an archaeologist, and I was working on what's called Nelson's Island in the Bay of Aboukir, the site of Nelson's great victory in 1798. And I received an email from P&O Cruises asking if I'd like to go on a cruise and talk about my archaeology and history experience. And I was very pleased to do so, and I've been doing that since about 2005.
Other reminders of maritime heritage are clearly visible elsewhere.
We have a very strong ethos on board P&O Cruises today, where we have formal nights. That's a throwback to the mail runs to India or the trooping runs to India, and everybody was expected to dress for dinner, and the dinner gong would sound an hour before dinner so that people could go down and get prepared for the evening meal.
I think not only do people like to have a little sense of connection with the past, about a sense of grandeur and specialness which prevails to this day. So dressing for dinner, not dressing for dinner in a way which are the rules of the club, but dressing for dinner because people enjoy it. They're connecting with something special, something aspirational.
Many of our passengers say to us that, at home there isn't an opportunity to do that. Everywhere you go now, whether you go to the opera, the theatre, go out for dinner, you don't have the opportunity to dress up like you do when you come onto one of our ships. So I think everybody very much enjoys our black tie evening, and it gives the evening a lovely sense of occasion.
On deck there's shuffleboard and deck quoits, some of those traditional games that are really as popular as the more modern pastimes we have today. And of course there's afternoon tea, which is now becoming more popular on land, but of course we've been enjoying afternoon tea on board our ships for years.
The welcome aboard cocktail party is a very important thing. It gives the new passengers a chance to meet members of the ship's company straight away. It also gives the repeating passengers a chance to see if they remember anybody or ask those questions where Captain so-and-so was or where Purser so-and-so's moved away.
Unlike the days of line voyages, dressing for dinner is no longer a nightly ritual. For many evenings, the dress code is informal or casual.
It's really a mainstream vacation product for all types of customers, whether retired or young, families, honeymooners. It really is a product that has become global and for every type of person, and it's made it very exciting.
Facilities for children were a feature of vessels in the past. Today, ships like Azura take this to another level.
We're more of an entertainment facility now, rather than the nursery nurses and the education setting. With facility-wise, we now dedicate entire deck spaces to the families and to the young people that travel with us, and we've now incorporated the latest games consoles, the interactive gaming, and we're trying to keep up to date with a lot of the trends for the teenagers as well as the young people travelling with us.
As well as maintaining tradition, the very crew itself often has links spanning generations.
But when my grandfather and father were at sea, I wasn't actually born, so I don't remember the time when they were on the ships. But from a young age, I was brought up with stories of mainly from my father telling me what life was like in the Merchant Navy, which is probably one of his most common phrases when I was in the Merchant Navy, and he still does it today. The only time my grandfather used to talk about it was when he was correcting my father, and now it's my father correcting me.
My dad's name was Miguel De Silva. He was a waiter till he retired. Typically from the place where I come from, a small place in south of India called Goa. So many of my father's friends were all with the company. They used to grow. They worked with the piano many years. Now their sons have come. It's been a history, is like a relation with the company for many years.
I was working with the grandfathers, and subsequently have worked with the fathers, and are now working with the grandsons of ship's company through the years. So we have loyal crew who are outstanding and amazing.
Well, rooted at the heart of our repeat business is our crew and officers. Many passengers comment on how amazing it is when they return to us that our ship's company recognize them either by face and so often by name, and this to them it really means something and it's very special.
The world is our oyster. P&O Cruises knows the world. We are very proficient in going round it. All our passengers do come with us because they know that we know how to do it. And I think that's the basis of a good world cruise.
We're very fortunate in having a very loyal group of passengers who come back year after year, and some of them have been coming back for years and years, 30 or 40 years, which is quite extraordinary. But they come back, they say it's like coming home. They come to their favourite P&O Cruises ship, they see crew that they recognise and officers they recognise, and of course we don't take that for granted in any way.
Past eras saw the development of steam power through to the transition from line voyages to cruising. In a changing world, there are always new challenges.
We are very much more aware of our place in the world and our impact on the world from the environment.
We're very concerned about emissions of CO2 and other waste products from our ships, particularly sulfur dioxide. And as a result of that, we're introducing new technology all the time. Our latest ships have a new design of engine, which allows us to run the engines in the most efficient way possible. We're also introducing other features, new features on ships, such as much more efficient air conditioning systems. We're managing water much better than we ever did, and as a result of managing our drinking water better, we're producing less wastewater.
We follow all of the international regulations. Indeed, we impose on ourselves stricter regulations than the international rules require. Each of our ships indeed carry environmental compliance officers. We have a no discharge policy around the world. We have the top of the range sewage treatment and water treatment plants, and we're very conscious also that what we put into the atmosphere from our diesel engines and gas turbines.
We're operating a ship. Yes, there's a technical side to operate. There's a deck or a navigation and seamanship side to operate, and of course there's a very large hotel side to operate. So we must see that it all goes forward together and make sure it all operates efficiently and well.
Today's P&O Cruises fleet is a world away from those early steamships of the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company. The rich heritage has given P&O Cruises the expertise and pioneering spirit to take cruising forward into the 21st century, ever changing and evolving to meet the needs of passengers. The range of what's on offer is more diverse than ever. It's now even possible to be married in the ship's chapel. While celebrating the past, the company is clearly focused on the future.
We're very lucky to be able to trace our roots back a while, and we can use that experience we've got to go forward.
The heritage of P&O Cruises is right at the soul of this company and at the souls of the people who work in the company. P&O has been at sea for 175 years. We have enormous experience and we are the very best at it, I believe.
We're very excited about the future. We have a new ship joining us in 2015 and we're currently planning and designing that ship as we speak, and it really will be the next generation of P&O Cruises ships, so it's a very exciting time.
The history of shipping is in our portfolio, and it's a big responsibility, but it's something we're very proud of, and it's something that we have to nurture. And I think we have, by growing these brands and making them even stronger than they ever were in the past.
Doing this, just coming into a berth. The Oriana's just tied up before. We passed them both during the night. We passed the Adonia just in the western approaches, and we passed Oceana about 12 o'clock last night. There we go.
impressive sight for Southampton. Only time ever. Ventura, Arcadia,